Welcome to our session today as we think deeply around the intersection of structural systemic racism and our environment. We are living in a particular moment where it is clear that environmental justice has been deeply under attack by the political establishment of this current moment as we think about the EPA being gutted the way it has over the last 4 years. Even as we think about the nature of environmental racism in our world, in places like the Bronx, that is often called Asthma Alley, where you have people who are children who are 5 times more likely to have asthma in that borough, that part of the borough of New York than almost any other part of the borough of New York. And we know that it's concentrated with many Black and Latinx lives there. We know what is the reality of Flint, that many years later, Flint is without clean water. We can think about Puerto Rico, which is also without clean water, and the way that cities like New Orleans and other places in the South that are dealing with a deep injustices related to what storm care and storm aftercare looks like. That we are clear that that our environmental crisis has a particular weight on Black and brown lives, that we are particularly vulnerable to the warming of our world, and there is a moral and even a theological responsibility for Black people of faith to make creation care and to make environmental justice one of the articles of faith of how we practice our Christianity, but also as we think about what our social justice agendas should be. And so I'm grateful today that we are gathered, that we are not only gathered by this conference, but we are joined by some very prolific writers, some salient thinkers around the issue of environmental injustice and its intersections with race and faith. Particularly, I'm grateful that we have Reverend Michael Malcolm, the Executive Director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. We are also joined by Harriet Washington, a prolific science writer. We're joined by Jackie Patterson, Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Group. And we're also joined we also can celebrate the presence of Dr. Greg Jenkins, Professor of Meteorology of the College and Earth Mineral Sciences at Penn State University. And so we have these four thinkers, activists, leaders who are going to help us think deeply about this crisis, what our role is as people of faith, as Jesus people, in combating this crisis, and helping us think deeply about why we must take this seriously as we live in an anti-science environment and we live in a lingering political crisis that is deeply in disbelief, or wants us to believe that they don't believe that our climate is changing. And so we'll ask that Harriet will get us started, and then we'll move to Reverend Michael, then we'll move to Jackie, and then we'll move to Greg.
Much. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to join these wonderful thinkers and share what I have learned about the relationship between environmental racism and African American health, particularly vulnerability to coronavirus 19 infection. It's a very direct connection. My 2019 book, A Terrible Thing to Waste, documented how it's not socioeconomics, but rather race that places people of color in environmental sacrifice zones. They're herded into these areas, kept there by various devices that change over time. But the important thing to realize is that it's our proximity and our engineered vulnerability that is responsible for our high disease rates. Unfortunately, a lot of the discourse, including scientific discourse, focuses on a putative biological difference between Black and white people that does not exist. It's not a biological difference, it's rather a difference in exposure. An article I wrote for Nature in May pointed out the direct correlation between every risk factor caused by environmental racism and the corresponding risk factor for coronavirus. Everything that is caused by environmental racism is also a risk factor for coronavirus infection. So the real question is that would it be strange if African Americans were not um, disproportionately affected? The surprise that greeted the data is really kind of ridiculous because we've already seen with HIV, hepatitis C, that people of color are more vulnerable to these diseases. They die more frequently, and it's because of their poorer exposure and their poorer treatment once they find the healthcare system. Not it's racism and not race that causes vulnerability. A really important point that often gets lost in discussions. So I also want to very briefly point out that there's more going on in our country, of course, than coronavirus 19 infection, although it's 250,000 people dead now. So it certainly is a horrible crisis. But the rise in violence that we're seeing is not unrelated. It's well known that high infection rates are closely tied to high rates of xenophobia. When there is threat of stranger infection, infections from strange foreign sources, violence, racialized violence always rises. And that's what we're seeing now. First, with Asians being attacked. At one point in June, there were 100 Asian people a day being physically attacked while being castigated for the coronavirus. Then it quickly transferred to African Americans. And now we're seeing resurgence of many kinds of violence that we're really familiar with, but they're escalating. It's not an accident. So all these things are really important. I'm looking forward to discussing them. But the last thing I want to point out very briefly is that there's been a blame the victim tone to a lot of discussion of African American high disease rates. Even our Surgeon General, who's African American, went on TV in April and began castigating people of color for drinking and drug use and smoking. These are not the risk factors. The risk factors are things beyond our control, and they're public health issues that need to be dealt with in a public health environment and without blaming people for illnesses that have been foisted upon them. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Dr. Francois, as well as the other panelists. I look forward to hearing what you all would have to bring to this discussion. I approach environmental justice in the way that I traditionally have been taught to approach it from a faith standpoint. And it's all about loving my neighbor. When I look at environmental justice or injustice, it is the things that harm communities that I consider to be my neighborly communities. And by neighbor, I don't mean neighbor as far as location is concerned. I mean neighbor and that there's another living being that exists outside of myself, whether it be people or planet. And I must, as a person of faith, speak up for the protections of people and planet. Now, we know throughout our nation and throughout especially the South, because that's where I concentrate mostly, we deal with environmental injustices in disproportionate portions when it comes down to us as African Americans, as well as other people of color and poor white communities and rural communities. We know that the harm that they suffer from isn't the harm that they do. And we know that they get blame shifted often. As a result, and as a faith leader, it's for me to speak truth in power and to stop the blame shifting and change the conversation and make the conversation become whether it's right or wrong versus whether it's politically correct or even economically expedient. It's whether it's right or wrong. Should we continue to pollute? Should we continue to overburden people with electricity bills and utility bills that keep them in poverty? Should we, at this time, while we have this coronavirus continuing to spike and we're seeing unprecedented numbers daily, should we continue to force people to go back to work, or should we imagine another way of doing life so that we can get a handle on this? These are the things that we as faith leaders, for me, ought to be considering and fighting for. As you said, Dr. Francois, we are now starting to look at ministry in a whole nother light. But I really want to push back on that a little bit and say we're not looking at ministry in a whole nother light. We're looking at ministry from the historical light that it was founded upon. And it was founded upon helping community, helping people. And I think that's what we're turning back to. And in fact, I believe that that's what this is now forcing us to do. I'll talk more about all of that as we go along.
Thank you. So yeah, it's an honor to be here with everyone, all the faceless masses that are out there, as well as it's an honor to be on this panel with Sister Washington and Cousin Malcolm and Brother Greg and Brother Francois. I am chiming in from Baltimore, sitting in my home, and I'm think about this whole concept of ecological justice, because we know that eco actually means home. And with this whole stay-at-home kind of situation we've been in, I've gained a whole new appreciation for home. That is for sure. Being here every day, all day, by just me, myself, and I. So, and I think about it in the context of this conversation we're having today around environmental justice. We know that as African Americans in particular, that our journey and the disparities that were so well described by Sister Harriet and Brother Malcolm are based on the origins of our history in this country, where we were taken away from our homes, our homeland, and put into ships, in the hull of ships as cargo, and then brought over to be the what became the generational wealth of white folks, basically. And that the vestiges of the transatlantic slave trade and what that means for us now has so many reverberating impacts. It's not just Black history, it's also Black today in terms of the impacts of our existence. So we know that from the time that we were disenfranchised from whatever, from wealth, from home, from family, to be brought here and to be treated as property and to be dehumanized. We also found that the way that we were able to even build home afterwards, after emancipation, the folks who were even able to get some level of property weren't able to properly hand down that property from generation to generation, because we didn't even have access to the legal services that would enable us to have legally binding agreements and wills to facilitate the legalized inheritance of our property. And then as we went on, we know the ways that as we began to acquire land and as we began to acquire some semblance of legal rights, we still had this kind of segregation, and that was then helped by redlining, and then helped further by urban removal and so forth. And it all kind of resulted in us being in communities that were more likely to be next to toxic facilities, more likely to be next to landfills, more likely to be afflicted with near roadway air pollution, less likely to have protections, everything from levees that would protect us from flooding, less likely to have access to resources like food. We all know our food insecurity issues, and less likely to have even basic resources like proper roadways and so forth. And so all of this has been institutionally and structurally kind of solidified in terms of our state. And so, but looking forward to that starts with the kind of the grim side of where we are, but also we also know that we are kind of paving a path towards liberation. We're looking to advance land justice, looking to advance food justice, looking to shift the way that we generate energy so that we're not generating fossil fuel-based energy production that harms our communities and harms the planet. And so we are beginning to turn things around, but we have to recognize the systemic ways we have to turn things around, because when we have a situation that is rooted in such institutionalized processes, then therefore we have to actually change the institutions and the systems if we're going to be able to see liberation. So again, joy to be here with you all and looking forward to our further discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you. This is community, and this is what it's all about. I just want to talk less and share more. I'm a sharer of knowledge, so that's what I do. And I would like to share just this brief presentation with the audience so that they can have a more firm grasp about climate justice. I no longer talk about climate change because climate justice incorporates all of the really debilitating things that happen to us because of our melanin content. And it has been for the last 500 years. So we have an ethical decision to make actually every day. But this is Africa as we know it today. And you see all the countries. But the true Africa and its diaspora is in South America, North America, the Caribbean, and even other parts. And all this is forced upon us. I mean, we did not leave smiling the continent, leaving from the continent. We were all forced into ships. And so that is the diaspora. And all of the diaspora is under pressure from climate change. So let me just run this for those of you who don't understand this issue about this is carbon dioxide, but in fact, all of the greenhouse gases are increasing over time. I just want to run this because this will start in 1979 when some of us were listening to Kool and the Gang. But this shows us that over time, that carbon dioxide is increasing. And if there were no inputs, it would just go kind of wiggle back and forth. But you can see here that this curve is going up, and that's telling us that we are accumulating the gas. Unfortunately, this gas has a very long lifetime, probably an order of 50 to 200 years. So when we drove this morning, it's very possible that the CO2 that was produced from our driving to the supermarket will be around, those molecules will be around when your great grandchildren are playing or running around. So this is really the issue. And unfortunately, our current administration has completely ignored this. But if we don't get a handle on this, this is going to be a devastating impact. And so some will say, well, we don't see changes in time. But what I can tell you is that this is a very unnatural curve. This does not represent kind of a balanced state. This is a very unbalanced state. And this will show you that if we go back further in time, that these values were more like 280 parts per million as we went into the Industrial Revolution, which, by the way, slavery really pushed the Industrial Revolution. We can go further back in time because we use ice cores. We can extract air bubbles from ice in the Antarctic or the Arctic. And we know that the values are higher now than they've ever been. And that spike at the end is our signal. And that is something we can't deny. We have never seen, not at least in the last million years, we have not seen these values. So let me just move forward. And so people are like, is the planet warming? Yeah, the planet is warming. This starts back in the 1800s. And you'll see over time through the temperature records that we have that the planet is warming. And it's warming at a faster rate today than it has in any time in the past. And this is the beginning. This is not the end. And if we just look at over the last 3 decades, the entire planet is warming, and most of the diaspora is warming, and the impacts are being felt, and the impacts are real. And one of the things that we really have to worry about, which is probably about 7,000 miles from where I live, is the Antarctic. Now, we expect 1 meter of sea level rise, or about 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. But this glacier in the Antarctic is just coming apart. 10 years ago, we never thought this. 5 years ago, there was evidence. Today, it is destabilized. And um, it has about 10 feet of sea level rise. It will probably disintegrate very fast. There is evidence that this disintegrated 129,000 years ago. And at that point, sea level was about 18 feet higher than we have at present. And when I work in Senegal, so when I'm in Senegal and I'm deep in a country and I see seashells way far away from the coast, I'm like, oh, the sea was higher. The other part are the extremes. I just want to show you what happened this summer. This is Western Africa, and this is the city of Dakar, and just in one day, just flooding everywhere. Millions of people struggling to deal with water. Poor people with little or no warning. This was the next day. Again, a neighborhood, uh, just normal people just trying to cope with something that's bigger than them. Again, impacting the most vulnerable in the world. And finally, this is the islands of Cape Verde, and a, just so fast, no one can react to these extreme changes that we're seeing. People are caught off guard, and people die, and the number of deaths are being underreported. Stop there. As you know, we have the most active hurricane season in all the records. 30 named storms. Here's an example of showing five. I've never seen this before. Five tropical systems over the Atlantic, once from the eastern all the way to the western, just impacting Louisiana. And of course, all the waste. And there's an environmental justice side to this waste because all this waste is going to be taken to landfills. Many of those landfills will be near Black communities. Um, we move on. But we have a difficult choice. And this is what it comes down to. We have to mitigate or we have to live life as normal. Now, our past informs us of bad things that have happened to us. And if we had to make those choices again, we would choose differently. So thanks. And I'm sorry to be a professor, but it's in my blood.
Thank you all for those opening remarks. I'm going to invite all of our attendees, if you have questions, to use the Q&A segment, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you, let's try to avoid putting our questions in the chat, but let's actually utilize the Q&A button for that. So again, I'm inviting all of us who are here today to participate in the conversation by adding your questions in the Q and A button. I'm really interested. Dr. Jenkins really walked us through some significant science, right? We got to see the data. We got to see images alongside numbers that I think are it's compelling. But I'm interested, Harriet. How do we and Dr. Jenkins, you can jump in here as well, Brother Greg, you can jump in here as well. But to Dr. Washington, how do we actually combat the anti-science sentiment that we are actually telling ourselves, large segments of this country is telling itself that this is not happening, that this is not that this is not human impacted, human influence. How do we actually combat the anti-science sentiments that is now at the highest levels of our empire? How do we do this? You're muted. Sorry.
Remember by now. We have two foes. There is the anti-science or pseudoscience faction, very powerful now, abetted unfortunately by our lack of government leadership, abetted unfortunately by a very much weakened EPA, which has lost its way. no longer does its job of protecting us. But the other foe is industrial science. The problem we have here is that the interests of the industry and the interests of African Americans and other people assailed by environmental racism are diametrically opposed. Industry does not want to spend money cleaning up the effects of the poisoning of our communities. Industry doesn't want to spend money testing industrial chemicals properly and not putting them on the market if we see signs of human health. You know, in this country, actually, let me start in Europe. In the European community, in the EU, you have to test industrial chemicals before you use them near humans. In this country, the testing is very, very poor and very weak and very inaccurate repeatedly. And so very often things are unleashed near humans, and only after people are injured is there any attempt to rein them in. The problem is that industry will demand higher and higher standards of proof, impossible standards of proof. If you look at lead poisoning, we're looking at people who've been suffered lead poisoning. At this point, we've lost billions of IQ points because industry demanded higher and higher levels of proof that lead poisoning was indeed poisoning, hurting children. That went on for decades. So you have that as well as the people who espouse pseudoscience, skepticism and doubt about scientific principles that they're very firmly, established. And doubt has become actually a product of industry science. There's a book called, Doubt is Their Product, which is true. So we have two foes here. And I think the way out is to have leadership in this country that respects science and understands the importance of crafting the best possible science when it comes to human health. We don't have that today, but we had that in the past. The EPA was actually doing a pretty good job of removing a lot of hazards until 2016, when there was an appointee by Trump whose avowed purpose was to destroy the EPA. I would say he did a really good job. So what we need now is someone who is going to be at the helm of the EPA, who respects science, who does not allow industry scientists to run herd over environmental activists and environmental scientists. And good science is going to be the road back. But you're absolutely right. We have to devote ourselves to that and make sure that industry participation is minimized.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Dr. Jink, did you want to hop in on this one?
Well, yeah, this is a justice issue, right? And we have to really think about how science has worked for or against us. And I'm saying each individual has to really think about that. Our communities have felt the impacts of climate change, we all know. So it's going to come down to, whether it's COVID or climate change, the data is in front of you. What do you want to do? I mean, these things are real, and we've got to teach our young people to pay attention and to document the things that are happening around them, including COVID, and this really just stay with the facts sometimes and not, trust everything on the internet. But there's real, people dedicate their whole lives to these issues. So I say stay with the facts.
Reverend Michael, there has to be a reworking of our theologies around the earth, around deservedness, around civic engagement. There has to be a reworking of our theology. Can you talk a bit about what a theology should include, can consist of, at the intersection of creation care, environmental justice, and Black lives? Is there a theological articulation? Is there a theological project that needs to happen? And what does that look like, so we can do theology for Black lives, but also theology for creation, care, and stewardship?
Yeah, Dr. Francois, I think I said at the beginning, for us who profess Christianity, we're taught to love our neighbors. For those who are of the Judeo faith, or for those who are of different faiths, they're also taught to be good good stewards and also taught to love their neighbors as well. And I think that's a universal rule that we can go by. We ought to build a theology around that versus a name it and claim it theology, versus a theology of prosperity. We need to go back to a theology of service. Reconnect with the history that are the foundation of our Christianity or our faith, which is to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So I don't think that we have to reach too far and make it as complex as we tend to make it. I think it's very simple. If we would form theologies that taught us to love those outside of ourselves, then we would naturally go against those toxic theologies that teach us rugged individualism as a virtue. I just don't think it's that hard. I think it's really quite simple. We make it complex.
I think that there's something really important about particularly this polarizing of the kind of theology that you talk about versus this kind of prosperity theology, which is probably more capitalist than it is Christian, although there's a connectivity between capitalism and Christianity. But really think about this, prosperity theology is actually leading to the kind of exploitative thinking that allows us to see the earth as something to be commodified, something to be exploited, something damaged without.
But I mean, that's the way that we look at our faith and our relationship with God as well. Pray about it. Just pray about it. That to me is superstition if you don't put any action behind your prayer. So we have that same thing. We pray and we want God to give us something or hand us something as if though God's a vending machine. And it's just, I just feel like we have that same perspective, that same view when it comes down to our theology, our Christian theology and the view of God. If we don't change that, again, it's about going back to look at service as being the foundation of our ministries, of our thinking, of our theology. If we look at it outside of ourselves, we've been taught to self-preserve, and that's birthed out of capitalism. And a lot of our theology that we have now is birthed out of capitalism. Nobody's trying to investigate it, though. I could go further, but there's plenty of other panelists, and we can loop back around to that if you like.
Jackie, I'm interested in and we'll get to this. I'll give everybody an opportunity to answer primarily the one question that's showing up in our box again and again in different ways. So I'm not going to ask you to answer it now, but Jackie, I'm interested in what is, as a part of the nation's oldest civil rights organization, and we've been hearing again and again that this is also a policy issue. Can you talk us through what a set of legislative remedies, what are some legislative approaches that that you have been involved in and that we should be thinking about in terms of our own advocacy? Is there a legislative proposal that Black folks should rally around when it comes to environmental racism and ecological injustice?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. So first off, I will point folks to a formation that's come together around what we're calling the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. So I assume folks have heard of the Green New Deal, but it's really kind of putting race as a through line in putting forward a suite of policies, because what we really need is a suite of policies in order to advance these inequities from a systemic level. And it needs to really start from everything from how do we think about reparations as a legislative agenda, given the extreme wealth differential with white American households averaging $171,000 in wealth, and African American households averaging $17,000 in wealth, and African American female-headed households averaging $5 in wealth. And so when we look at those types of extreme differentials, there needs to be a major transfer of wealth for us to truly have the type of remedies we need in terms of climate change and environmental injustices. And so that's one thing. Another is that we need to significantly increase regulations. As we know with this new administration, and even under COVID-19, with the recent administration, we had a rollback in already insufficient regulations that has 71% of African Americans living in counties in violation of air pollution standards. And so we do know that, and that's harming the health of our communities, but also it's contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions that have resulted in what we've seen with this being the most hurricanes ever in one season, the most land that was destroyed by wildfires, and so forth and so on, all these statistics that we know of. So we need to roll forward with stronger regulations and stronger monitoring and enforcement. We also need to look at what our land policies are as it relates to displacement due to sea level rise. As was pointed out by Dr. Jenkins, we're already experiencing sea level rise and displacement of our communities as a result, whether it's the Biloxi, Chittamauga, Choctaw tribe in southern Louisiana that was recently displaced as their land was inundated and is now no longer inhabitable because of sea level rise. So we need to be looking at how do we finance the migration of our communities within this nation, because we have a number of communities that are standing in harm's way. And with climate forced migration, we also need to be looking at our immigration policy so that we have fairer immigration policies. There are folks coming up through Latin America that have come over from Africa to Latin America, and then folks who are, of course, living in Latin America. And with US being 4% of the global population, but 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, we are responsible for people having lands that are no longer inhabitable and trying to come here just to be able to survive. And we do have a land of abundance in spite of the scarcity narrative that invokes so much fear. So those are some examples of the types of policies we need to be putting forward.
Good. No, thank you for that. That's really helpful. And this is to everyone. As you all continue to populate your questions, please bring those in, and we'll get to them. We'll get to them. Let me ask this question: at what point will it be too late? Right? Have we reached that point yet? I mean, obviously, it seems like we haven't, because we're saying there's some remedies, there's some ways to salvage this. But just at what point will it be too late to recourse?
Well, science has said that about 3 years ago, I believe it was, Cousin Jackie, scientists said that we had 12 years at that time, and they were being conservative even. And it's not to say that it'll be too late as if we'll be destroyed. What they're saying is, who knows what's going to happen, because we've never seen this before. And what we've seen thus far, we've got bigger hurricanes, bigger floods, bigger earthquakes. That's not going to let up. It'll only get worse. So who knows what the planet will be like? Who knows what a planet will be like without a New York City, Miami, California. And I'm actually saying that to bring in climate migration, because I think it's important for us not just to talk about the problems, we also have to talk about the solutions, but we also have to talk about the effects that are happening now. And as you're seeing sea level rise, as Doc talked about earlier, you're starting to see sea level rise, so you're starting to see climate migration, meaning people are moving more inland. Therefore, gentrification is happening, but also the scarcity of resources is slowly happening. And so we have to consider all these things when we're considering what could exist outside of the mark that the scientists have said that we have before we need to turn this around. And if we go by their timeline, we're looking at about 7 more years now.
I think is baked in right now. I feel like we're running ahead of what all the models have been projecting. What with respect, I mean, the hurricanes, for example, are intensifying as they're making landfall. Again, I've never seen that before, but these Cat 4s, 5s, I mean, incredible damage. There was this idea of 2 degrees C as being, or about 3.8 degrees above pre-industrial levels being the danger point. But truthfully, there are already regions that are above this amount. And they're talking about the global. We are going to pass that. But the probably most worrisome thing to me is the sea level rise, and partly related to the Antarctic. I mean, this Thwaites Glacier is going to come out fast. It's not going to be 100 years. When it becomes unhinged, and we think that's going to be relatively soon, you can't stop the ice from flowing out to the ocean. And it takes on average 100,000 years to build an ice sheet. So when you lose it, it's gone. So like that's just it for our grandkids and our great grandkids. We just have to slow this thing down, but we know we're gonna catch some of it. There's no way around it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. I also wanted to add that for many African American communities, particularly in this country, it's already too late. There's more than climate change. Of course, we're looking at a synergy of many, many environmental hazards. And there are already areas in this country where children are losing millions of IQ points every single year. There are areas in this country like Anniston, Alabama, where it's a post-apocalyptic landscape. People are mowing their lawns wearing surgical masks, and that would before coronavirus struck. And people can't grow vegetables except in 55-gallon drums because the soil is poisoned from pesticides that were banished 40 years ago, but linger in the soil. Every year, Consumer Reports issues a report on baby food, and it points out that every single year, baby food is a #1 cause of lead poisoning for most American children. Because again, many of the pollutants are lingering in the food and water, and even organic vegetables have traces of them. So I would submit that we would be very wise to listen to Dr. Jenkins and realize that in too many areas, it's already too late. We don't have the luxury of trying to pinpoint some imaginary time when we need to take action. We need to take action yesterday.
Yeah, thank you on that grim point. Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, but it'll be a lot grimmer if we don't.
No, I just really want to reinforce it because for some areas it's too late, and for some people it's too late. I mean, we've lost people, so obviously that's irreversible, and we've lost. I mean, we know that Barbuda, for example, after I think it was Maria, for the first time in its 300 years of existence, it was uninhabitable. No one lived on the island of Barbuda. So, so absolutely affirming that point. And I also just want to say, just in terms of solutions, that we need to remember that the earth was designed divinely. It was designed to be a regenerative, and that is exactly what we need to lean into as a people. We need to lean into regenerative design, whether it's making sure that we're getting our energy from the sun and from the wind, that we're really, instead of kind of genetically modified food and so forth, and all the ways that Terminator seeds that Monsanto, the big agricultural company, develops, really being more in touch with the land and recognizing that the land was designed to provide all that we need, and it can provide all that we need. We've just gone astray. And so really thinking about all the ways that we can engage reimagine our systems to be on principles of regeneration and cooperation. And we need to be thinking about that both policy-wise and practice-wise.
Dr. Francois, piggybacking our cousin Jackie, I'd like to talk about a specific community in Alabama, in North Birmingham. This community has been historically for over 100 years surrounded by polluting industries, in particular coking plants. And the soil there, you can't grow anything going. They've even advised the children there not to go outside and play. All of the soil is contaminated, but they still have these people living in this community. Many people in this community have felt the effects, disproportionate effects of cancer, rare forms of cancer. Children have learning disabilities, as well as physical disabilities. The rate of asthma is astronomically high. Yet they still have these people living in this community. We cannot talk about environmental anything without talking about environmental racism. And when it gets down to it, here's what communities of faith can actually do in a practical sense starting today. Start talking about othering other people. Start really looking at and investigating, are my ministry practices othering others? Or does it bring a light to the disparities of others? Because for me, and this is my bottom line, and the reason why I do what I do and speak where I speak and go where I go and work how I work, my bottom line is if you help people, you can heal the planet. We don't have to chase solutions for the planet. Let's chase solutions to help these people. If you quit polluting these people, you'll quit polluting the air. And the air quality would be better. That helps the planet. If you quit polluting, you'd have effective soil so that you can have these regenerative practices so that the planet can regenerate. That helps people and it helps the planet. So for me, you can't take one without the other. And I think oftentimes we wanna, rush to do something for the planet and the people still suffer. There's no reason why people in that community should still be living in that community, knowing the effects of the pollution in that community. Help those people, heal the planet.
Well, let's. I mean, the dominant question in the chat is, what can we do? So, can we get Rev just gave us a approach to that and an approach to that, and he can obviously add to it if he has more to say. But for our other panelists, what should we be doing right now, whether it's structural or whether it's individual? What should we be doing?
I'd like to address that. I think it's important to recognize that there's very little that an individual can do to address these larger issues. These are results of corporate malfeasance that is sanctioned by government. So it's actually problematic to ask individuals to fix it. They can't fix it. It's a very subtle form of blaming the victims. Not to say that they can't do anything. There are things they can do to protect their own homes and their own families, but they have limits. They're not going to necessarily address the larger problem or help the communities. And a terrible thing to waste, which you don't have to buy. You can look at a copy in a library. The last 2 chapters I devoted to precise things that people can do. First, things they can do within the confines of their own home. And they're pretty simple. There are things like HEPA vacuums, getting rid of vermin, learning to prepare food in a way that avoids pathogens and is cheap, like home canning, different options, and just identifying what kinds of risk that are not necessarily obvious, like fishing. Subsistence fishing is really big in African American communities, but people don't understand that larger fish are more dangerous than smaller ones. They concentrate the pathogens. Things like that, very specific, but within your own home, there are often things you can do to minimize your exposure. Then in terms of your communities, it's important to organize and find also to find support in legal support and scientific support, and they exist. There are groups like, to give one example, Earth Justice is devoted to helping communities address toxic exposures in their own community. They not only will help you fill the proper paperwork to try to force EPA attention and governmental attention, but they'll help you with basically plans and how to develop a very effective action. Media attention is also very helpful in these things. If you can get a newspaper interested in your community and things have been done to it, that can really help your cause. It addresses that. So there are many things that you can do, but it's really, in my opinion, you have to understand the limitations of those things. You can try to protect people in your home up to a point. You can do that. You can try to get your community to get efficient help and get attention and hope to resolve the issues there. But the larger questions have to be resolved in law and by the government. And that's why it's really important to vote with an eye to people's environmental agenda. That's very important. I know I personally did not think much about that before the last decade or so, but now it's one of the #1 things I pay attention to when I decide who I'm going to vote for and support politically. And that should be the case for everyone else too.
Thanks, Dr. Washington.
Yeah. So, right, I would say a couple of things. One is it's true, there is a challenge around kind of this notion of personal responsibility that can be given the systemic issues that need to be changed.
Yeah.
And I definitely agree that there are the ways that we need to be thinking about how we are living regeneratively, because that all kind of if we all do it, then it's 1,000 points of light in some ways. But the other thing is that to the extent that we can make sure that we are organizing, whether it's through our churches or organizing through our community groups, but organizing, being a part of organizing to build power to shift, to make the changes that we need is critical. We've seen with the elections how really each person, we needed each vote in order to make that happen. And similarly, we need each person engaging around, whether it's making sure that we show up at those zoning board meetings, giving testimony at those public service commission meetings, like actually kind of educating ourselves about these critical systems that we can be a part of changing. I would say so that's the way that we do it individually, and these are the types of systems that we need to be able to change. We need to make our zoning boards accountable to the will of the people as opposed to the will of the corporations.
Right.
We need to make sure that our politicians are also, and that's why I put in the chat that a critical piece is getting money out of politics, because we have to stop making our politicians beholden to the interest of corporations. So that's my biggest point.
Dr. Will, real quick, because I know I'm talking to healthy churches, healthy planet, and I know I'm talking to some folk that's got resources. Not only can you help practically in that, and in the regard of you doing individual actions, not only can you help in changing the system, but one of the systems that hurts us in our Black communities is there's very little investment in the nonprofit sector. So those who are public servants, those who are doing good for our communities, struggle, literally struggle for their daily substance. It would be awesome if communities of faith would partner with some of these nonprofit organizations that are already doing this work and invest in those nonprofit organizations that are doing this work. Not just in your treasure, but also in your time and your talent as well. Adopt it as a ministry and see if you can't partner to help it to grow, and it can help your community.
I just like to say that I feel like as individuals, there are things we can do. This whole thing is driven by consumption, and we have to really think about consumption. So if I'm overweight, which I am, I need to think about what I'm eating every day. the planet is in the same kind of way. We're from same source. We have to think about that. But I really feel like we need to empower our youth. Now, this is around whether it's green jobs or dealing with plastic pollution or the toxic. We have to unleash the genius in our young people. And this has to happen at the community level. Now, I'm not saying individual, it has to happen at the community level. Another thing is that none of our HBCUs have really climate change slash climate justice programs where people can actually elevate themselves to address these issues through policy or community work or at the table with the science. If we don't understand that these are intergenerational problems, even the EJ problem is intergenerational, and we don't pass down our blueprints and say, you got to do more, this thing ain't going to happen, especially for climate change. We got to be at the table, and they have to know what the issues are. And when Jackie Patterson was fighting for policy, they have to know what that policy was so they can build on it.
Good. This has been an enlightening experience, and hopefully it has given some of us opportunity to think deeply about the intersection of our work as faith communities and our responsibility as occupants, as residents of the earth, in either making those adjustments that are necessary in our individual lives, but more so finding ways to apply pressure to people with power, particularly those in political power and those that seemingly have our political infrastructure bought and paid for, these corporations. So I hope that you all are thinking about ways that as congregations we can do this work individually. We can do this work as I guess we can call ourselves communities of education and activism, but also find ways that we can apply pressure to those spheres of power so that we can make a big difference in our planet and really do the kind of world saving work that this is requiring. And I believe it's the kind of world saving work that Jesus expects us to do as we are students and a part of that lineage of truth telling and life saving. So I'm going to ask if we could just get a because we're out of time. We only have 1 minute left. So again, I want to thank Harriet, thank Jackie, we thank Brother Greg, and we thank Brother Michael for their contributions today. And I hope that you all will find ways to continue to connect with their ministries, calling them ministries, because it's awesome work that they do in helping us be better humans. And that's sacred work to me, and offering us ways that we can be healthier churches. So thanks everyone again for attending and for your questions and for the awesome work that we're going to do to save our world. I'll turn this over to our leaders, to our liaisons, as we do whatever transitions are necessary to continue our time of learning and activation.